I got 38 voicemails from my family in a single night after 6 years of silence, and every single one of them said the exact same 2 words over and over again like they were rehearsed or desperate or both. And what made it worse was that just 6 years ago, those same people stood in our dining room, looked me in the eye, and told me I was no longer part of this family, that I was a burden they were finally done carrying, and then they watched me walk out the front door with $200 in my wallet and not one of them tried to stop me, not even when I turned around and waited for anyone to say my name, but no one did. And now suddenly they couldn't stop calling, couldn't stop leaving messages, couldn't stop saying those same 2 words like their lives depended on it. And I didn't know if I should feel angry, confused, or afraid, but I knew one thing for sure, something was very wrong, and I could feel it before I even pressed play on the first voicemail. So, before I tell you what those 2 words were, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, because I always wonder how far stories like this travel. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 29 years old. And this is the night my past came back all at once and changed everything I thought I had escaped. But to understand why those voicemails mattered, you need to go back 6 years to the night I stopped being their daughter. It didn't happen all at once, not really, it was something that built slowly over years like a crack in glass that keeps spreading until one day it finally shatters. In our house everything revolved around my older sister Jessica. She was 3 years older, confident, polished, the kind of person who could walk into a room and have everyone turn toward her without trying. My parents loved that about her. They built their entire image around her success, her achievements, her future, and I was just there, not a problem exactly, but not a priority either. I learned early how to stay quiet, how to not ask for too much, how to take up as little space as possible, because every time I needed something it came with a sigh or a comparison or a reminder that Jessica had already done it better. When she got her first car at 16, it was a brand new white SUV with a red bow on the hood. When I turned 16, I got a used sedan that stalled at red lights if I didn't press the gas just right. When she went to college, my parents paid for everything, tuition, housing, even a monthly allowance. When it was my turn, my dad sat me down at the kitchen table and told me I needed to be realistic, that not every investment made sense. Those were his exact words, not every investment made sense. And I remember nodding like I understood, like it didn't hurt, like I wasn't hearing that I was the one they didn't believe in. But that wasn't the worst part, because I could handle being overlooked. I could handle being second. What I couldn't handle was what happened the night everything fell apart. It was a Friday, early fall, still warm enough that the windows were open. I had just gotten home from a late shift at the coffee shop where I worked. I was tired, still in my apron, and I could hear voices in the dining room, sharp, tense, the kind that makes your chest tighten before you even know why. When I walked in, all 3 of them were there, my mom standing by the table, my dad sitting at the head, Jessica leaning back in her chair like she already knew how this was going to end. There was an envelope on the table, my name written across the front in my mom's handwriting, and I remember thinking maybe this was something good for once, maybe I was wrong about everything. But then my dad spoke, and the way he said my name told me I wasn't. He said, "Emily, we need to talk," and the room felt smaller instantly, like the air had been pulled out of it. My mom wouldn't look at me. She kept adjusting the edge of the tablecloth like it needed fixing, and Jessica just watched me, calm, almost curious, like she was waiting to see how I'd react. And then my dad slid the envelope toward me and said, "We know what you did." And I remember blinking, confused, because I hadn't done anything, not anything that would explain the tone in his voice, the finality of it. I asked him what he meant, and that's when Jessica leaned forward and said, "Stop pretending, Emily, it's embarrassing." And suddenly I understood, not the details, not yet, but the direction this was going, the way it always went, her word against mine, except it was never really a contest, because they had already decided who to believe. My dad started listing things, accusations that didn't make sense, money missing, lies I hadn't told, things I hadn't touched, and every time I tried to speak, to explain, to defend myself, he cut me off, his voice getting sharper, colder, like he wasn't just disappointed, he was done. And my mom finally looked at me, but there was no softness in her eyes, just something tired and distant, like she had already accepted a version of me I didn't recognize. And then she said, "Maybe it's better if you just go, just for a while until you figure things out." And I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because it didn't feel real, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I asked them if they were serious, if they really believed this, and my dad didn't hesitate. He said, "You've been a problem for a long time, Emily, we just didn't want to admit it." And that was the moment something inside me shifted, something quiet but permanent, because I realized I wasn't going to change their minds, I wasn't going to win this, I wasn't even going to be heard, I was already gone to them, they just hadn't said it out loud until now. And then Jessica said something I'll never forget. She said, "Maybe now we can finally have some peace." And the room went completely silent after that, like even the house was holding its breath, and I stood there for a second, waiting, hoping one of them would take it back, that someone would say this had gone too far, but no one did, so I picked up the envelope, opened it, and inside was $200 in cash, folded neatly like this was planned, like they had prepared for this moment, and my dad said, "Take it and go," and I did because there was nothing else left to do. I walked out of that house with $200 and no plan and no one on my side, and I didn't look back until I reached the end of the driveway, and even then no one was standing there, no one called my name, no one came after me, and that was the last time I heard from them until 6 years later, when my phone lit up with 38 voicemails in a single night, all saying the same 2 words. I did not listen to the voicemails that night, not even one. I just stared at my phone as it kept lighting up over and over again on my kitchen counter, the screen flashing the same 3 names I had erased from my life 6 years ago. Mom, Dad, Jessica, then again and again and again until the notification stacked so high I could not see the time anymore. And for a second I thought about turning the phone off, just ending it right there, pretending none of it was happening, because that is what I had trained myself to do: ignore them, move forward, survive without looking back. But something about the pattern would not let me, something about the fact that they all said the same 2 words, something about the urgency and the timestamps minutes apart, sometimes seconds, like they were taking turns or sitting in the same room calling me one after another. And I could not shake the feeling that whatever was happening on their end was bigger than pride, bigger than control, bigger than anything that had pushed me out of that house 6 years ago. So I picked up my phone, held it in my hand, and still did not press play, not yet, because the truth is I was not ready to hear their voices again. Not after everything, not after how quiet my life had become without them. The apartment I was standing in was small, just under 600 square feet, 1 bedroom, thin walls, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbor's television through the drywall if you stood still long enough. But it was mine, every piece of it: the second-hand couch I bought off a college student moving out of state, the chipped coffee table I sanded down myself, the mismatched plates in the cabinet that I had collected one at a time when I could afford them. Nothing in that space had ever been given to me. Nothing had been handed down or paid for or arranged. I built it slowly, paycheck by paycheck, hour by hour, and for 6 years that had been enough, more than enough. It had been peaceful in a way I never knew was possible. No comparisons, no quiet sighs across the table, no conversations that stopped when I walked into the room, just silence. And for the first time in my life, silence did not feel like rejection, it felt like control. The first year after I left had been the hardest. I slept on a friend's couch for 3 weeks before she moved in with her boyfriend and I had to find somewhere else. I remember standing outside a bus station at 2 in the morning with my backpack and that envelope of cash, counting what was left and realizing I had to make it last longer than I thought. I picked up shifts anywhere that would take me: coffee shops, grocery stores, cleaning offices after hours, jobs that did not ask too many questions, jobs that paid just enough to get me through the next week. And I told myself every night that it was temporary, that I just needed time, that I would figure something out. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the silence, not the peaceful kind I have now, but the heavy kind, the kind that presses down on you when you realize no one is going to call, no one is going to check in, no one is wondering if you are okay. I checked my phone constantly back then. Even when I knew there would be nothing, I would open my messages, scroll, close them, open them again, like something might magically appear if I looked often enough, but nothing ever did, and slowly, painfully, I stopped expecting it. I stopped reaching for my phone every few minutes. I stopped imagining what I would say if they called. I stopped rehearsing apologies for things I did not do. And that was the moment everything began to shift, because when you stop waiting for someone to come back, you start moving forward whether you are ready or not. By the second year, I had saved enough to rent my own place, a studio apartment with a window that looked out over a parking lot. It was not much, but it was a door I could lock, a space where no one could tell me I did not belong. And I remember sitting on the floor the first night, eating takeout straight from the container, and realizing I had made it further than anyone thought I would, further than they expected, further than I expected, and for the first time I felt something that was not survival, not fear, but something quieter, steadier, something like pride, and I held on to that. I built on it. I took classes at a community college, night classes after work, slow progress, one course at a time. I did not tell anyone, there was no one to tell, but that made it easier in a way. No pressure, no expectations, just me learning, improving, becoming someone I had never been allowed to be before, someone who did not need approval to keep going. By year 4, I had a stable job at a small logistics company, entry-level at first, answering phones, organizing shipments, but I paid attention. I learned quickly. I stayed late when no one asked me to, and eventually someone noticed. My supervisor started trusting me with more responsibility, more decisions, and that trust felt different than anything I had known growing up. It was not conditional. It was not compared to someone else. It was mine, earned, and I protected it. I built my life around it: routine, structure, quiet progress, and somewhere along the way the past stopped feeling immediate. It became something distant, something I could think about without my chest tightening, something I could leave behind without wondering if it would come back. Until that night when it all did at once in the form of 38 voicemails sitting on my phone waiting, and I realized as I stood there in my small carefully built life, that ignoring them would not make this go away, because whatever had made them call me like that, whatever had made them say those same 2 words over and over again, it had already reached me, and whether I wanted it or not, the past was no longer staying where I left it. I finally pressed play on the first voicemail. At 1:17 in the morning, sitting on the edge of my couch with my phone in both hands like it might disappear if I let go. And for a second all I heard was breathing, uneven, rushed, like whoever was on the other end had been crying or running or both, and then my mother's voice came through, thinner than I remembered, almost unfamiliar, and she said the 2 words slowly like she needed me to hear them clearly, "Call us," and then the message ended, just like that, no explanation, no apology, no context, just those 2 words, and I sat there staring at the screen waiting for more. But there was nothing, just silence again, and something in my chest tightened, not from guilt, not from love, but from confusion, because 6 years ago they had made it very clear they did not want to hear from me. They had cut me out cleanly, decisively, and now suddenly I was the one they needed to call back, so I opened the second voicemail, this time from my father. And his voice was different, lower, strained in a way I had never heard before, but the words were exactly the same, "Call us." And then it ended, and the third, Jessica, same 2 words, but her voice was sharp, almost urgent, like she was trying to keep control of something slipping away, "Call us." And by the time I got to the 10th message, the pattern had not changed, just those 2 words over and over again, different tones, different pacing, but always the same, and that repetition was what made it worse, because it meant this was not random, this was intentional, this was coordinated, and I could not tell if that made it more serious or more manipulative, and I hated that I could not tell the difference. I paused the messages and set my phone down, pressing my palms into my eyes for a second, trying to slow everything down because my first instinct was to ignore it, to protect what I had built, to not let them pull me back into whatever this was. But there was a part of me that kept replaying the sound of their voices, the way my mother's voice had cracked slightly on the first message, the way my father had not sounded in control, and that part of me would not stay quiet. It kept asking the same question over and over again, what happened, because something had changed, something big enough to make them reach out after 6 years of nothing, and I knew my family well enough to understand that they would not do that unless they had no other option, and that thought sat heavier than anything else because it meant this was not about me anymore, not really, it was about whatever situation they were in now. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, did not drink it, just held it in my hand because I needed something steady, something simple, and I started thinking through possibilities, trying to make sense of it. Had someone gotten sick? Had something happened with money? Had Jessica done something that finally caught up with her? And that last thought lingered longer than the others, because if there was one constant in my life before I left, it was that everything revolved around her. Everything was adjusted to protect her, to support her, to make sure she never faced consequences alone. And I wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if that system finally broke, if the thing they had built around her collapsed, who would they turn to then? And the answer apparently was me, the person they had labeled a problem, the person they had removed, the person they had told to leave and not come back. And now here they were, calling me 38 times in one night, telling me to call them back like nothing had happened, like 6 years had not passed, like they had not watched me walk away without a second thought. I went back to the couch and picked up my phone again, scrolling through the timestamps, noticing how the calls overlapped, how sometimes my mother and father had called within the same minute, how Jessica's messages came in clusters, 3 or 4 in a row, like she was trying to get through when the others could not. And there was something frantic about it, something unplanned, like they were reacting in real time, not following a script, and that was what finally pushed me, because my family was not chaotic, they were controlled, calculated, every conversation had a purpose, every decision had a reason. And this did not look like that. This looked like panic, and panic meant something had gone very wrong. I clicked on the 15th voicemail, then the 20th, then the 25th, and the pattern held, "Call us," over and over again, but the voices were changing, getting rougher, more strained, less controlled, and by the time I reached the 30th message, my mother was crying openly, not trying to hide it, her voice breaking between the words, "Please call us." And that was the first time the message changed, the first time there was anything beyond those 2 words, and it stopped me. Because my mother did not say please, not to me, not ever, and hearing it now felt wrong, like something in the world had shifted out of place, and I did not know what to do with that. I did not know how to respond to that version of her, because it did not match anything I had experienced before, and that made it harder, not easier, to decide what to do next. I sat there for a long time after that, phone in my hand, the last few voicemails untouched, Because I knew that once I listened to all of them, once I reached the end, I would have to make a decision. I would have to either call them back or not. And either choice would change something, either choice would break the distance I had spent 6 years building. And I was not sure I was ready for that, but I also knew that doing nothing was still a choice, and it would not make this disappear. Not this time, not with 38 messages sitting there, not with my mother crying into the phone, not with my father sounding like he did not have control anymore. And as I looked down at my phone, I realized something I had not wanted to admit. I was going to call them back, not because I forgave them, not because I missed them, but because whatever had made them reach out like this, it had already crossed into my life, and I needed to know what it was before it pulled me in completely. I stared at my phone for what felt like an hour before I finally tapped my father's name. Not because I wanted to hear his voice first, but because I knew he would answer. He always did when something mattered, and the line rang once, twice, and then it clicked, and for a moment neither of us spoke. There was just that faint static you only notice when you are waiting for something to break, and then he said my name, Emily. And it sounded different, not sharp, not controlled, just tired, and I did not respond right away. I let the silence sit there between us because I needed him to feel it. I needed him to understand that this was not normal, that this was not a conversation he could step back into like nothing had happened. And finally I said, "You have 38 voicemails. What do you want?" And my voice came out steady, flatter than I expected. And there was a pause on the other end, like he was choosing his words carefully, something he never used to do with me. And then he said, "We need you to come home." And that word hit me harder than anything else he could have said. Home, like it still belonged to me, like I had not been told to leave it, like I had not stood at the end of that driveway waiting for someone to call me back. And I almost laughed, but I stopped myself because something in his tone kept me from reacting the way I wanted to, something underneath it, something I could not quite name yet. So instead I said, "That is not my home." And there was another pause, longer this time, and I could hear movement in the background, voices muffled, overlapping, and then my mother's voice cut in, closer to the phone now, "Emily, please." And that word again, "please," and I closed my eyes for a second because hearing it from her still felt wrong. Like I was listening to a version of her that had never existed before, and I said, "Stop saying please like that changes anything, just tell me what is going on." And this time it was Jessica who spoke, her voice sharper, faster, like she was trying to keep control of the conversation. "We cannot explain everything over the phone, you just need to come here." And there it was again, that same tone she used to use when she wanted something done without question, when she expected the world to adjust around her. And for a second I felt that old instinct rise up, that reflex to comply, to avoid conflict, but it faded just as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something I had built over 6 years without them. And I said, "No, you do not get to do that anymore. You do not get to tell me what to do without explaining why. You lost that right." And the silence that followed was different, heavier, like something had shifted in a way they did not expect. And I could almost picture them looking at each other, recalculating, adjusting. And then my father spoke again, slower this time, more deliberate. "Something has happened, Emily, and we cannot fix it without you." And that sentence hung in the air longer than anything else because it confirmed what I had already suspected. This was not about reconnecting, this was not about regret, this was about need. And I felt something cold settle in my chest, not anger, not yet, just clarity, because I finally understood the situation for what it was. They were not calling me because they missed me, they were calling me because they needed something from me, and the difference mattered more than anything else. I leaned back against the couch, letting that realization sink in, and I said, "What exactly do you think I can fix?" And this time no one answered right away, and that hesitation told me more than any explanation could have, because my family never hesitated. They always had answers, always had reasons, always had control, and now they did not. Now they were quiet, uncertain, and that uncertainty made me uneasy in a way I could not ignore, because it meant whatever had happened was bigger than their usual problems, bigger than money arguments or social image or anything I had seen before. And finally my mother spoke again, her voice softer now, almost breaking. "It is your sister." And everything in me tensed at that, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed exactly what I had been thinking. It always came back to Jessica, everything did. And I said, "What about her?" And this time my father answered, his voice lower, like he did not want to say the words out loud. "She is in trouble." And that was it, just that, no details, no explanation, just those 3 words. And I felt a flicker of something I did not expect, not concern, not sympathy, but curiosity, because for the first time in my life, the person who had always been protected, always been prioritized, was the one in trouble. And the system that had always supported her was no longer enough, and they were calling me to fill that gap. I sat there for a second processing that, and then I said, "Then handle it, you always do." And there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, like I had said something they were not prepared to hear, and Jessica's voice came back, tighter now, less controlled. "This is not the same, Emily, this is serious." And I almost asked what that meant, almost pushed for more, but I stopped myself because I realized something important in that moment. They needed me more than I needed them, and that changed the entire balance of this conversation. So instead of asking, I waited, and that silence stretched long enough that I knew they felt it. Knew they understood that I was not going to move until they gave me something real, something concrete. And finally my father said, "If you do not come, everything we have built could fall apart." And that sentence landed heavier than anything else he had said, because it was not about Jessica anymore, not just her, it was about all of them. Their reputation, their stability, their entire structure, and for the first time I could hear the fear in his voice, real fear, not frustration, not anger, but something deeper, something that did not fit the man I had grown up with. And I realized in that moment that whatever was happening, it was not small, it was not temporary, and whether I wanted to be part of it or not, I was already standing at the edge of something that was about to pull me back into a life I had spent 6 years escaping. I did not answer right away after my father said everything could fall apart. I just sat there holding the phone, listening to the faint sound of their breathing on the other end, and for a moment it felt like I was standing in that dining room again, except this time the power had shifted, this time they were the ones waiting. And I realized something that changed everything about how I saw this situation. They were afraid of losing something, not me, not the relationship, but something tangible, something they could not afford to let go of, and that meant whatever Jessica had done, it was bigger than a mistake, it was something that threatened all of them. And I said slowly, "Then explain it." And there was a hesitation again, shorter this time, like they were deciding how much to reveal, and then Jessica spoke, her voice tighter now, less controlled than before. "It is complicated." And I almost laughed at that, because that was always their word, complicated, the word they used when they did not want to take responsibility, when they wanted to blur the truth just enough to stay in control. And I said, "No, it is not, you just do not want to say it." And there was a sharp silence after that, and I could tell I had hit something real, because the air on the other end shifted, the way it does when people realize they cannot keep the story together, the way they planned. And finally my father said, "There is a situation with money." And that was the first concrete thing anyone had said, and it immediately narrowed everything down, because money was the one thing my family understood, the one thing they protected above everything else, their image, their stability, their reputation, all of it was tied to that. And if there was a problem there, it meant something had gone very wrong. And I said, "What kind of situation?" And this time my mother answered, her voice shaking slightly, "Jessica made a decision, and it did not go the way we expected." And the way she said decision made it sound smaller than it was, like she was trying to soften it, trying to make it manageable, but I knew better, because they would not be calling me like this if it was something small. And I said, "How much?" Because that was the real question, not what happened, but how big it was. And there was a pause, longer than before, and when my father finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost careful. "More than we can cover." And that was when everything clicked into place, because that sentence meant one thing: they had already tried to fix it. They had already used their resources, their connections, their system, and it had not been enough, and now they were out of options, and that was why they were calling me. I leaned back again, letting that settle, and I said, "And you think I can fix that?" And this time there was no hesitation, no pause, just a direct answer, "Yes." And that certainty caught me off guard, because it meant they knew something I did not, something about me, about what I had been doing these past 6 years. And that realization sent a small ripple of unease through me. Because I had been careful, I had kept my life separate, private, I had not shared anything with them, not directly, but clearly they had found something, enough to believe I was their solution. And I said, "Why?" And the line went quiet again, and then Jessica spoke, her voice lower now, less defensive, more controlled in a different way. "Because we know what you have been doing." And my grip on the phone tightened slightly at that, not enough to show, but enough that I felt it, because that sentence crossed a line. It meant they had been looking, watching, gathering information, and I did not. Like that, not at all. And I said, "You do not get to track my life after everything you did." And she responded quickly, "We did not track you, Emily, we found you." And there was something in the way she said found that made it sound intentional, like they had been searching, like this had not just happened by accident, and that made everything feel heavier, more deliberate. And I could feel the conversation shifting again, moving into something deeper than just a request for help, something closer to control. And I did not let that happen. I said, "Then tell me exactly what you think I can do. Because right now all I hear is that you need something, and you expect me to come running after 6 years of silence." And my voice stayed steady, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something that had been building since I pressed play on that first voicemail. And this time my father did not try to soften it. He said it directly, "We need access." And that word landed differently than everything else because it was specific, it was intentional, and it was not emotional. It was transactional, and I felt that cold clarity settle even deeper because now I understood this was not about reconciliation, this was not about fixing a relationship, this was about using me to fix a problem, and I said, "Access to what?" Even though I already had an idea, and there was a brief pause before he answered, "Your accounts, your position, your connections, whatever you have built, we need it." And that was the moment everything shifted completely because they were not asking for help, they were asking for control over something I had created without them, something they had no right to. And for a second I just sat there in silence, letting that reality settle in because it confirmed what I had always suspected. They had never seen me as part of the family, not really. I had always been a resource, something to be used when needed and discarded when not. And now they were trying to pull me back into that role like nothing had changed, like I had not spent 6 years building a life that did not depend on them. And I realized in that moment that this was the real test, not whether I would go back, but whether I would let them take what I had built. And as I held the phone in my hand, listening to their silence on the other end, I knew that whatever I said next was going to decide everything. I did not respond immediately after my father said they needed access. I just let the words sit there between us, heavy and exposed, because now everything was clear in a way it had not been before. This was not about fixing a mistake. This was about them trying to reach into my life and take something I had built without them. And for a moment I felt that old pressure rise up again, that instinct to explain myself, to justify what I had, to defend it. But I stopped it before it could take hold. Because I realized something important, I did not owe them an explanation, not anymore, not after the way they had cut me out, not after 6 years of silence, and I said calmly, "No." And the word landed harder than I expected, not because it was loud, but because it was final, and there was a pause on the other end, a long one, like they were trying to process what they had just heard, like they were not used to that answer coming from me. And then Jessica spoke, her voice sharper now, the control slipping again. "You do not understand how serious this is." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, that tone, that shift from expectation to pressure, and I said, "No, I understand exactly how serious it is. You just think I am going to fix it for you." And there was a small break in her breathing, just enough to tell me I was right, and my father cut in quickly, trying to steady the conversation. "Emily, this is not about you, this is about the family." And that sentence hit something deeper than anything else they had said, because it confirmed what I had always known but never heard so clearly. It was never about me, not then, not now. And I let that sit for a second before I answered. "It has never been about me to you." And the silence that followed was different, heavier. Like something uncomfortable had finally been said out loud and no one knew how to move past it. I stood up and walked slowly across my apartment, not because I needed to, but because I needed to feel grounded, to remind myself where I was, what I had built. And I looked around at the space that had taken me years to create, the life that had not included them, and I said, "You told me to leave, you gave me $200 and told me I was a problem. You do not get to call me 6 years later and ask for access to anything." And my voice stayed steady, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been building since the moment I heard my mother say please, something that was not anger exactly, but not forgiveness either, and my mother spoke again, her voice softer, almost pleading, "We made mistakes." And that word mistakes felt too small, too clean, like it was trying to reduce everything that had happened into something manageable, something forgivable, and I did not let it pass. I said, "No, you made a decision." And that distinction mattered. Because mistakes happen without intention, but what they did was deliberate, and I needed them to hear that, to understand that I had not forgotten, that I was not going to pretend it had been something else. There was a shift on the other end again, quieter this time, less defensive, and for a moment I thought maybe they were finally going to say something real, something honest, but instead my father said, "We can fix this, Emily, we can make things right." And I closed my eyes for a second because that sentence sounded like something from a script, something rehearsed, something that did not match the urgency of 38 voicemails or the fear I had heard in his voice earlier. And I said, "You are not trying to fix anything, you are trying to save what you are about to lose." And that was when the tone shifted completely, the last layer of control dropping away, and Jessica spoke again, faster now, more direct. "Fine, yes we are, and if you do not help us everything falls apart, not just for me, for all of us." And there it was finally, the truth without the filter, without the soft edges. And it confirmed everything I had already understood. This was not about rebuilding a relationship, this was about survival, their survival, and they were willing to come to me because they had nowhere else to go. I stopped walking and leaned against the wall, holding the phone a little tighter now because this was the moment where everything narrowed down to a choice, not a complicated one, not a layered one, just a simple, direct decision, and I said, then maybe it should fall apart. And the reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, a quiet sound from my mother, something like disbelief, and my father said my name again, but this time there was something else in it, something closer to desperation, and I realized in that moment that they had never considered this possibility. Not really, they had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but not refusal, not a complete break from the role they had assigned me. And that realization gave me something I had not expected to feel, not satisfaction exactly, but clarity, because for the first time I was not reacting to them. I was deciding for myself. There was a long silence after that, longer than any we had so far, and I could hear them talking quietly to each other, muffled voices, pieces of words I could not make out, and then my father came back on the line. His voice lower now, more controlled again, but not in the same way as before. This time it felt like he was choosing his words carefully, not out of authority but out of necessity, and he said, "If you do not help, this does not end with us, Emily. It comes back to you too." And that sentence changed everything because it introduced something new, something I had not considered, not just their problem but a connection to me, something that could reach into my life whether I wanted it to or not. And I felt that small ripple of unease again, sharper this time, because now this was no longer just about them trying to pull me back. It was about something that might already be tied to me in ways I did not understand yet. And as I stood there in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, I realized that saying no might not be enough to keep me out of whatever they had created. I did not answer him right away after he said it could come back to me. I just stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, letting those words settle in because they were different from everything else he had said, not a request, not a demand, but a warning, and I felt something shift in my chest, not fear exactly, but something closer to alertness, because for the first time this was not just about them anymore, this was about me, about something that could reach into the life I had built and disrupt it whether I agreed to help or not, and I said slowly, "What do you mean it comes back to me?" And there was a pause, not the hesitant kind from before, but a deliberate one, like he was deciding how much to reveal, and then he said, "Some of the accounts are connected." And that sentence hit harder than anything else, because it did not just suggest a problem, it confirmed a link, something concrete, something real, and I felt my grip tighten on the phone without realizing it. Because I knew immediately what he was implying, not fully, not the details, but enough to understand that whatever Jessica had done, it had somehow intersected with something tied to me, something I had built carefully, intentionally, over years, and I said, "That is not possible." But even as I said it, there was a small part of me that was already questioning it, already running through possibilities, already trying to identify where that connection could exist. Jessica spoke again, her voice lower now, less aggressive, almost controlled in a different way. "We would not be calling you if it was not." And there was something in that sentence that made it harder to dismiss, not because I trusted her, but because the situation itself did not make sense otherwise. They would not have come to me like this unless they had a reason, unless there was something they could not solve without me. And I started thinking back through the last few years, through the systems I had worked with, the projects I had been involved in, the people I had trusted, trying to find the point where something from my life could overlap with theirs. And at first nothing came to mind because I had been careful, I had kept my distance, I had built everything separately. But then a small detail surfaced, something I had not thought about in a long time, something that had seemed insignificant when it happened, and I felt a slight tightening in my chest as it came into focus. It had been about 2 years ago, early in my time at the logistics company, when I was still proving myself, still taking on anything that came my way, and one of the senior managers had asked me to help process a series of new accounts, high-value clients, fast-moving, the kind of work that required precision and speed, and I had handled it the same way I handled everything, carefully, methodically, making sure every detail was correct, and I remembered one of the names, not clearly at first, but enough that it started to connect with something familiar, something from my past, and I had dismissed it at the time because it had not seemed important, because I had no reason to think it was connected to anything personal. But now, standing there with my phone in my hand, listening to my father talk about linked accounts, that memory felt different, heavier, like it was no longer just a coincidence. I said, "What account?" And this time there was no hesitation. My father answered directly, "The one you helped set up 2 years ago." And that confirmed it completely, and I felt a sharp clarity settle in, because now I knew this was not random, this was not just bad luck, this was a direct line between something I had done and something they had become involved in. And I said, "That was a corporate account. It has nothing to do with you." And Jessica responded immediately, "It does now." And There was something in her voice that made it clear she was not guessing, she knew exactly what she was talking about, and that made everything feel more serious, more immediate, because it meant this was not just a financial issue on their end, it was something that had already crossed into my world. I walked slowly back to the couch and sat down because I needed to think, to process, to understand what this meant before I reacted, and I said, "Explain it." And this time they did not avoid the question. This time my father spoke in a way I had never heard before, direct, stripped of everything unnecessary. "Jessica used that account to move money and now it is being audited." And those words landed with a weight that made everything else fall into place, because audit meant scrutiny, it meant attention, it meant that whatever had been done was no longer contained, it was being looked at, examined, questioned, and if my name was anywhere near that account, even indirectly, then I was part of that process whether I wanted to be or not, and I felt a cold realization settle in because now his warning made sense. It could come back to me, not emotionally, not relationally, but legally, professionally, in ways that could affect everything I had built. I said, "Why would she use that account?" And Jessica answered, quieter now, less defensive, "Because it looked clean." And that sentence hit harder than anything else because it meant she had chosen it intentionally. She had seen something in my work, something in what I had built, and decided it was safe to use, safe to move through, and that realization brought something else with it, something sharper, something closer to anger. Because this was not an accident, this was not a mistake, this was a decision, a calculated one, and it had been made without me, without my knowledge, without my consent, and now I was being pulled into it anyway. I leaned forward slightly, my voice still steady, but colder now, clearer, and I said, "You used my work without telling me, and now you expect me to fix it." And there was no denial this time, no attempt to reframe it, just silence, and that silence confirmed everything, and I realized in that moment that this was not just about whether I would help them, it was about what had already been done, what had already been set in motion without me. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet on the other end of the line, I understood that this situation was no longer something I could ignore, because whether I chose to be involved or not, I was already connected to it in a way that could change everything. For a few seconds after Jessica admitted she had used my account because it looked clean, I did not say anything. I just let that sentence echo in my head, because it explained everything and at the same time made it worse, because it meant she had seen exactly what I had built, exactly how careful I had been, and she had chosen it not because it was convenient but because it was safe, because it would not raise questions, and that meant she knew what she was doing from the beginning. And I said slowly, "You knew it would trace back to me eventually." And there was a small pause before she answered, quieter now, "Not like this." And that answer told me everything I needed to know. She had taken a risk, calculated it, and assumed she would stay ahead of it, just like she always had, just like she had always been allowed to do. And now that it had caught up with her, she was looking for a way out, and I was part of that exit whether I agreed or not. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to stay focused because this was no longer emotional, this was practical, and I said, "What exactly are they looking at?" And my father answered immediately, like he had been waiting for that question. "Transactions over the last 18 months flagged irregular movement. They are tracing the flow." And the way he said tracing made it clear this was already in motion, already past the point of being contained, and I felt that cold clarity settle deeper because once something is being traced, it does not stop where you want it to, it follows the path completely, and if my name was anywhere along that path, then I was already part of the process. And I said, "And my name is attached." And there was no hesitation this time, indirectly, but yes, and that was enough, more than enough, because indirectly still meant connected, still meant visible, still meant I could be pulled into whatever came next. I stood up again, pacing slowly across the room because sitting still made it harder to think, and I started piecing it together in my head, the account setup, the structure, the permissions, the way transactions were routed, and I realized something that made my chest tighten slightly. There were points in that system where oversight depended on patterns, not individual names, which meant if those patterns were broken, if something unusual happened, it would not just flag the transaction, it would flag the structure itself, and that structure included my work, my configurations, my oversight. And I said, "They are not just looking at the transactions, they are looking at the system." And my father said quietly, "Yes." And that confirmed it completely. This was bigger than just Jessica's actions, this was about the entire framework, and I was part of that whether I wanted to be or not. I stopped walking and looked around my apartment again, but this time it felt different, not unsafe, not yet, but no longer separate, no longer untouched, because something from outside had already crossed into it, something I did not invite, something I did not control. And I said, "So what exactly do you expect me to do?" And this time my father answered carefully, like he had thought this through. "We need you to help us understand what they will see, what they will question, and how to Address it before it escalates. And there it was, not access in the sense of taking something from me directly, but using what I knew, what I understood, to navigate a situation they could not manage on their own, and I could see the logic in it. I could see why they had come to me, but that did not make it acceptable, not after everything, and I said, "You want me to protect you from something you caused using my work?" And there was no response to that because there was no way to reframe it, no way to soften it. It was exactly what it sounded like. My mother spoke then, her voice quieter, almost fragile. "We did not know it would come back to you like this." And for the first time I heard something real in her voice, not control, not calculation, just worry, and that made it harder, not easier, because it reminded me that this was not just a problem on paper. This was something affecting real people, even if those people had hurt me, even if they had pushed me out, and I felt that conflict rise up. Not strong enough to change my position, but enough to make me pause, enough to make me think about what would happen if I did nothing, if I let it unfold without stepping in. And I did not like the answer to that because it did not just end with them, it reached back to me, to my work, to my stability, and that was the part one could not ignore. I said, "If I help, it is not for you." And my voice was clear, steady, because I needed them to understand that, to not confuse this with forgiveness or reconciliation. And my father responded immediately, "We understand." But I could hear the relief in his voice anyway, and that told me everything. They did not need me to come back as a daughter, they just needed me to fix the problem, and once that was done, everything else would go back to the way it was. And that thought settled heavily, because it meant I had to be careful, not just about what I did, but how I did it, what I allowed, what I protected, because this was not just about resolving a situation. This was about maintaining control over my own life while navigating something they had already disrupted. I sat back down slowly, holding the phone a little looser now because the decision was forming, not fully, not completely, but enough that I could feel it taking shape, and I said, "I will not come back there." And there was a small pause, but no argument this time, no pushback, just acceptance, because they knew they did not have leverage for that anymore, and I continued, "If I do anything, it will be on my terms." And my father said, "Of course," too quickly, too easily, but I let it pass for now because the details would matter more than the agreement, and I said, "Then you start by telling me everything, not pieces, not summaries, everything, because if I am going to be involved in this at all, I need the full picture." And the silence that followed was not hesitation this time, it was preparation. And I realized as I sat there, listening to the quiet on the other end of the line, that this was no longer about whether I would be pulled back into their world. It was about how much of it I would allow. And for the first time since my phone started lighting up that night, I felt something steady settle in. Not control over the situation, not yet, but control over my place in it, and that was enough to take the next step. It has been 6 months since that night, and my life does not look the same, but it finally feels like it belongs to me in a way it never did before. Not because everything is perfect, not because everything is fixed, but because I made choices this time that were mine, not reactions to someone else's expectations, not compromises shaped by fear or guilt, just decisions rooted in clarity, and that changed everything. I never went back to that house, not once. I never stood in that dining room again, never sat at that table where I learned to shrink myself to fit their version of who I was supposed to be. Instead, everything happened on my terms, calls, documents, conversations, all of it controlled, measured, intentional. I helped navigate the situation enough to protect myself, to make sure my name, my work, my future were not damaged by something I did not create, but I did not carry their burden. I did not fix what they broke. And that line mattered more than anything else. Because for the first time I understood what boundaries really meant, not walls to keep people out, but lines that define what you are responsible for and what you are not. And I stayed on my side of that line no matter how many times they tried to pull me across it. Jessica's situation eventually stabilized, not because I saved her, but because the system did what it always does. It forced accountability, it exposed what needed to be seen, and it reshaped everything around it. My parents adapted like they always do. They shifted, adjusted, found a way to hold on to what they could, but something in the dynamic changed permanently, not because they suddenly understood me, but because they finally realized they could not control me anymore, and that realization created a distance that no longer felt painful. It felt necessary, it felt right. We speak sometimes now, not often, not deeply, just enough to acknowledge that we exist in the same world, but not in the same way, and I am okay with that, more than okay, because I no longer measure my value by how close I am to them. I measure it by how aligned I am with myself, and that shift is something I never thought I would find, not after everything, not after the years of being told who I was supposed to be. But it turns out that distance, real distance, can do something powerful. It can give you space to hear your own voice clearly for the first time. If you are listening to this and you feel like you are the one who was pushed out, overlooked, or made to feel like you were not enough, I want you to know something simple but important. You are not defined by the people who could not see your value, and you do not have to go back just because they finally do. You are allowed to build something on your own terms, you are allowed to protect it, and you are allowed to decide who gets access to it, even if that decision is difficult, even if it means standing alone for a while, because sometimes standing alone is where you finally learn how strong you really are. Thank you for staying with me through this, for listening, for holding space for a story that is not always easy to tell, because stories like this can feel isolating, but they are not. There are more people out there carrying similar experiences than we realize, and maybe hearing this reminds you that you are not the only one figuring it out one step at a time. And if this story spoke to you in any way, I would love to hear where you are in your journey, what boundaries you have had to set, or what you are still working through. And if it truly resonated with your heart, you can show your support quietly by liking or subscribing, but only if it feels right to you. My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old. And the lesson I want to leave you with is this: your value is not something others get to define. It is something you protect, build, and choose for yourself.